At a lavish wedding, Barron Trump stuns the crowd by interrupting the ceremony with a shocking revelation. As guests gasp and the bride trembles, he unveils a hidden truth that could change everything. Who is hiding a devastating secret, and will the wedding go on? Stay tuned for the full, incredible story. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow, we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The grand ballroom shimmered under the soft glow of towering crystal chandeliers, their golden light reflecting off the polished marble floor. The scent of fresh roses and expensive perfume lingered in the air, as elegantly dressed guests whispered excitedly, their murmurs blending with the soothing melody of a live string quartet. Tonight was no ordinary wedding. It was an event that had captivated New York's elite. The union of Isabella Carter, daughter of one of the most influential families in the city, and Daniel Pierce, a charismatic young entrepreneur whose name alone could sway stock markets, was the social event of the year. Every prominent businessman, politician, and celebrity lucky enough to receive an invitation was present, sipping champagne and waiting for the ceremony to unfold. At the altar, Isabella stood in a breathtaking white gown that cascaded in delicate lace, her veil lightly draped over her flawless complexion. Her hands, adorned with heirloom rings, trembled slightly as she held Daniel's steady grasp. She glanced at her parents, who sat beaming with pride, her father's eyes filled with satisfaction, her mother dabbing the corner of her eye with a silk handkerchief. Everything was perfect, just as Isabella had dreamed since she was a little girl. The love of her life stood before her, their future moments away from being sealed with a vow. The officiant cleared his throat and smiled warmly. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." His voice carried through the hall, but before he could continue, a murmur rippled through the audience. At first it was subtle, just a few heads turning toward the back of the room. Then the whispers grew louder, a ripple of confusion spreading like wildfire. The music faltered, the musicians exchanging uneasy glances. A chill seemed to pass through the grand hall as the guests' attention snapped toward the entrance. Walking down the aisle, flanked by two imposing security guards in black suits, was Barron Trump. His tall frame moved with deliberate confidence, his piercing gaze locked onto the altar. He was not on the guest list, and yet, there he was, commanding the room without saying a word. The air grew thick with tension as he strode forward, his polished black shoes clicking against the marble floor in the eerie silence. The officiant hesitated, glancing at Daniel and Isabella for guidance, but neither of them spoke. Isabella's heart pounded against her ribs. Daniel's grip on her hand tightened, almost painfully. "What the hell is this?" he hissed under his breath, his jaw clenching. Barron ascended the stage steps with a composed expression, stopping only when he was directly in front of the couple. His eyes flickered over Isabella for a brief moment before locking onto Daniel with quiet intensity. Then, in a calm but commanding voice, Barron Trump raised the microphone and shattered the silence with 8 words that sent a shiver through the entire room. "Before you take this step, there's something you need to know." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face, her fingers growing cold against Daniel's grip. The air became suffocating. The whispers turned into a deafening wave of uncertainty, people shifting in their seats, wide eyes darting between Barron and the now visibly tense groom. Daniel's jaw twitched. He stepped forward, his voice low and furious. "Barron, whatever this is, it ends now. You weren't invited." Barron didn't flinch. His stance was unwavering, his voice as composed as if he had rehearsed this moment 100 times. "I know this moment is sacred," he said slowly, his voice carrying over the anxious crowd. "But I couldn't stay silent. Someone needed to speak the truth." Isabella's breath hitched. "What truth?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her heart pounded in her chest like a war drum, her mind racing. Was this a publicity stunt? A misunderstanding? Or was this something far worse? Barron's gaze darkened as he took another step forward, The weight of his next words seemed to linger in the air before he finally spoke. "Your love story isn't as it seems. There's a secret, one that could change everything." The silence that followed was paralyzing. For the first time since she walked down the aisle, Isabella felt something was terribly wrong. She turned to Daniel, expecting to see the same confusion, the same disbelief that was flooding her own thoughts. Instead, she saw something else, a flicker of panic. And that's when she knew Barron Trump wasn't here to play games. He was here because the truth had finally caught up to them. A chilling silence filled the grand ballroom. The air, once warm with celebration, now crackled with tension as Barron Trump's words hung over the gathering like an approaching storm. Isabella's world felt as though it had tilted off its axis. She looked at Daniel, her fiancé, the man she had given her heart to, and for the first time, doubt crept into her chest, like a shadow slithering under a locked door. Her breath hitched as she clutched onto Daniel's hand, searching for reassurance. But his fingers, which had been strong and steady moments ago, felt clammy now. He was too still, his grip unnaturally rigid. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscle twitched beneath his skin. Then he did something that made Isabella's stomach drop like a stone into a bottomless pit. He looked away, just for a second, but that second was enough. It wasn't the defiance she expected, not the outrage of an innocent man falsely accused. It was something else. Guilt, panic, fear. Barron didn't need to say another word, but he did. "You deserve to know the truth before you say I do," Barron continued, his voice steady but edged with something colder now. He turned to Isabella, his expression unreadable. "I don't take pleasure in doing this, but I won't stand by and let you step into something built on lies." The guests were now leaning forward, their breaths held captive in the suspense. Some clutched their pearls, others exchanged wide-eyed glances. The elite of New York, normally so composed, were watching a scandal unfold before them in real time. Isabella's mother reached for her husband's hand, her nails digging into his skin. The whispers swept through the ballroom like an uncontrolled wildfire, bouncing off the gold-trimmed walls. What did Barron know? What was he about to say? "Say it," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. She felt her chest tighten, her pulse hammering in her ears. "If there's something I need to know, say it now." Daniel jerked his head toward Barron, his blue eyes flashing with barely contained fury. "Don't do this," he ground out, his voice like gravel under pressure. "Not here. Not now." Barron arched a brow. "If not here, then when?" A sharp inhale echoed from somewhere in the crowd. The ballroom was no longer a wedding venue. It had become a courtroom. And Barron was delivering the case that could shatter everything. From his pocket, he pulled out a sleek black folder. The moment it appeared, Daniel's face drained of color. That was all the proof Isabella needed. Her hands went ice cold as Barron tossed the folder onto the altar. It landed with a soft but resounding thud, its weight far heavier than the sum of its contents. The guests gasped as Isabella bent down, her fingers trembling as she opened the folder. Photos spilled out onto the altar, glossy images reflecting the flickering candlelight. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her eyes darted across the pictures, her stomach twisting into painful knots. Each one was a betrayal, in ink and paper. A photograph of Daniel in a dimly lit restaurant, his arm wrapped around a woman. Another of them laughing, lost in a moment only lovers should share. And then the worst. One of them in an embrace that was far too intimate to be explained away. She wasn't just a stranger. Isabella recognized her instantly. Daniel's ex-girlfriend, the one he had sworn was out of his life. Isabella's head spun as she stepped back, her lips parting but no words coming out. "This isn't," Daniel started, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "You lied to me," Isabella whispered, her voice breaking. "It's not what it looks like," he shot back, stepping toward her. His hand reached out, but she pulled away as though his touch would burn her. "What does it look like then, Daniel?" Barron's voice cut through the chaos like a knife through silk. He stepped forward, his expression calm but his tone sharp, because it looks a lot like deception. The weight of Barron's words crashed over the entire room. The world, as Isabella knew it, was breaking apart right in front of her. Daniel's chest rose and fell heavily, his entire body stiff with tension. "I swear it was a mistake," he pleaded. "It happened before we got engaged, Isabella. Before you and I—" But the damage was done. A single tear slipped down Isabella's cheek, but she quickly brushed it away, refusing to break in front of a crowd. She had never felt so humiliated, so foolish. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel hesitated. That hesitation sealed his fate. Barron sighed, running a hand through his hair before delivering the final blow. "You've been seeing her for the past 6 months." A collective gasp echoed across the ballroom. Daniel flinched. Isabella let out a shaky breath, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. 6 months, she repeated, her voice suddenly eerily calm. "And you thought I'd never find out?" Daniel shook his head violently, stepping toward her. "It's not what you think, I swear. I love you, Isabella." But Isabella was no longer listening. She turned on her heel and walked off the altar, away from the man who had shattered her trust in an instant. The guests parted like waves, their wide-eyed stares following her as she moved. Behind her, Daniel's voice cracked with one last, desperate plea. "Isabella, please." But she never looked back. The ballroom felt like a collapsing stage, a performance gone horribly wrong, with the actors frozen mid-scene, unsure of their next move. Gasps, murmurs, and the rustling of expensive fabric filled the air as Isabella strode away from the altar, her mind racing, her vision blurred. She couldn't believe it. Not Daniel. Not the man she had trusted with her heart, her future. Daniel lunged forward, attempting to follow her, but Barron stepped into his path, blocking his way like an immovable wall. "You've done enough," Barron said, his voice low but commanding, the weight of his words anchoring Daniel to the floor. "Let her go." Daniel's chest rose and fell erratically, his breathing sharp. His hands balled into fists at his sides, his frustration barely contained. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he snapped, his voice venomous, shaking with fury. "You come here, uninvited, and destroy my wedding? What kind of game are you playing, Barron?" Barron didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, but his gaze burned like steel. "This isn't a game, Daniel," Barron said evenly, tilting his head slightly. "The only one playing games here was you." Daniel let out a humorless laugh, his fingers raking through his perfectly styled hair, now slightly disheveled. "You don't know what you're talking about. This is between Isabella and me, not you, not anyone else." Barron's eyes narrowed, his stance unwavering. "Then why couldn't you tell her the truth?" Silence. Dead silence. The weight of that single question suffocated the space between them. Daniel opened his mouth, then shut it again. His jaw tensed, his shoulders slumped just slightly, the first crack in his armor. "You hesitated," Barron observed, his tone quiet but merciless. "And that says everything." A whisper rippled through the crowd. The truth was sinking in, solidifying like wet cement. Daniel had lost control of the narrative, and for the first time in his life, he had no way of spinning it in his favor. But Isabella was already gone. She had stormed through the heavy ballroom doors, her pristine gown dragging behind her like the remnants of a dream ripped apart at the seams. She didn't stop until she reached the empty garden, the only place where she could breathe. The cold night air stung against her flushed cheeks, but it was nothing compared to the burn in her chest. Tears threatened to fall, but she refused to let them. Not here, not now. Not for him. A few seconds later, a pair of footsteps crunched against the cobblestone behind her. "Isabella." She recognized the voice instantly. It wasn't Daniel. It was Barron. She turned around slowly, arms crossed, her breathing uneven. "You should have let me find out on my own," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not like this. Not today." Barron exhaled, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. I know, but when I found out, I couldn't stand by and watch you say, "I do," to someone who didn't deserve you. Isabella let out a broken laugh. The sound held no joy, only pain. "Deserve me?" she repeated, shaking her head. "You don't even know me." "Maybe not," Barron admitted. "But I know betrayal when I see it." A shudder rippled through her chest. The weight of everything that had happened was beginning to crash down on her all at once. The lies, the humiliation, the months spent believing in something that hadn't even been real. "How long did you know?" she asked, her fingers tightening into the delicate lace of her dress. Barron hesitated, just a second too long. "Long enough," he finally said. Isabella's lip trembled, her chest rising sharply as she struggled to keep herself from breaking completely. "And you waited until now?" Barron ran a hand through his hair, the guilt flickering in his otherwise composed expression. "I had my reasons," he said carefully. "I wanted to be sure. I didn't want to ruin something unless I knew—" "Unless you knew I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life?" she interrupted, her voice raw, edged with heartbreak and exhaustion. Barron didn't deny it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night stretched long and silent between them, the moonlight casting a soft glow over the garden. The sounds of distant city life buzzed faintly in the background, but here, in this moment, there was nothing but her pain and his truth. Finally, Isabella let out a shaky breath, her walls breaking just slightly. "What do I do now?" she whispered. Barron's gaze softened, his voice quieter than before. "You take time," he said. "You don't rush to forgive, you don't run back to him. You let yourself feel everything. And when you're ready—" He paused, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to will strength into her soul. "You start over, on your own terms." Isabella stared at him for a long time, her lashes wet with unshed tears. And for the first time since the night had begun, she didn't feel completely alone. The world outside had not yet woken up, but Isabella had not slept. She sat in her hotel suite, the city lights blinking through the window, their reflection shimmering on the half-empty champagne glass she hadn't touched. Her wedding dress lay crumpled on the floor, a ghost of the life she thought she was walking into. She replayed the night over and over in her mind. Barron's voice, Daniel's silence, the truth that had shattered everything. A sharp knock at the door startled her, pulling her out of the endless loop of painful memories. She hesitated before standing, her steps slow, wary. When she opened it, she wasn't sure what she expected. Danielle, begging for another chance? Her mother, trying to contain the scandal? Instead, the concierge stood there, a thick envelope in his hand, his expression unreadable. "This was left for you, Miss Isabella," he said politely. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, her pulse quickening. A letter. From him. She barely murmured a thank you before shutting the door, leaning her back against it as she turned the envelope over in her hands. Daniel's name was written in his familiar, careful handwriting. For a long time, she simply stared at it. Did she even want to read it? Finally, she tore it open, her heart pounding as she unfolded the letter. "Isabella, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know the truth, the whole truth. I never wanted to hurt you. Every moment I spent with you was real, but there were things I was afraid to tell you. Things I thought I could fix before they ever reached you. And that was my mistake. The woman in that photograph, Sophia, she was my past. I was young, reckless, and I married too fast. We tried and we failed, but I never filed the papers. I told myself it didn't matter, that we were over in everything but legality. But I should have told you. I should have told you everything. You deserved the truth, and I kept it from you. Not because I didn't love you, but because I did, and I was terrified of losing you. And now I have. I won't ask you to come back to me. I won't ask you to forgive me. But I need you to know that you were never a lie. I love you, and I always will. Daniel." Isabella read the words again and again, her hands tightening around the paper. She could almost hear his voice in the words, the regret woven into every sentence. Her chest ached, and for the first time since she had walked out of that ballroom, she let herself cry. She cried for the love she thought she had. She cried for the future she had lost. She cried for the man who had broken her heart, and yet, in some twisted way, still owned a part of it. But most of all, she cried for herself, for the girl who had walked down that aisle with a dream in her heart, only to have reality rip it away. When the tears finally stopped, she wiped her face and set the letter down. She had her answer now. Daniel's words may have been sincere, but they didn't change what had happened. They didn't change the fact that he had let her believe in something that was never real. And she couldn't go back to that. A soft knock broke the silence once more. She turned, her heartbeat still unsteady, and slowly walked to the door. When she opened it, she wasn't surprised to find Barron standing there. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried the same quiet understanding they had the night before. "I figured you could use this," he said softly, lifting 2 cups of coffee in his hands. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a small, exhausted smile tugging at her lips. "Come in," she whispered. As Barron stepped inside, Isabella felt something shift. The pain was still there, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the loss. But as she sat across from Barron, cradling the warmth of the coffee in her hands, she realized something else. She was no longer drowning in it. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to let go. The morning air was crisp, carrying a quiet stillness that seemed to hold the weight of the night before. Isabella sat in the hotel suite, the remnants of her shattered wedding scattered around her discarded flowers, the once perfect dress now wrinkled and forgotten. But the chaos outside paled in comparison to the storm inside her. She turned the letter over in her hands again, reading the words one last time. Daniel's apology, his regret, his love. A part of her wanted to believe it, to believe that love alone could erase deception, that regret could undo betrayal. But another part of her, the part that had been crushed under the weight of his lies, knew better. Love without truth wasn't love at all. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She took a breath before standing, her fingers tightening around the letter. She already knew who it was. When she opened the door, Daniel stood there, his face pale, his eyes filled with something close to desperation. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his usually confident posture replaced with something almost fragile. "Isabella," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said softly. He nodded, stepping inside, but there was an unspoken tension between them now, one that hadn't existed before. He sat across from her at the small table, his hands clasped tightly, as if he were holding himself together. "I got your letter," Isabella started, her voice even but not unkind. Daniel exhaled, nodding. "I meant every word." She studied him carefully. "I know you did." A flicker of hope crossed his face, but she wasn't finished. "But the problem isn't just that you lied, Daniel," she continued, her voice steady. "It's that you let me believe in something that was never real. You stood beside me, knowing the truth, and you let me walk toward you anyway." His jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists. "I was scared, Isabella. I didn't want to lose you." "But you did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell into a heavy silence. Daniel looked away, his shoulders tense. "I thought I could fix it before you ever found out." She shook her head, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "That's the problem, Daniel. You thought you could control the truth, but the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface." His head snapped up, his eyes burning with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Do you still love me?" he asked suddenly, his voice raw. The question stole the breath from her lungs. She swallowed hard, her pulse pounding in her ears. Did she? She had spent nights dreaming of this life, of a love that would stand the test of time. She had imagined forever in his arms, had believed in the promises he whispered in the dark. But now, standing at the edge of that dream, she realized love wasn't the problem. She had loved him. She still did. But love wasn't enough. When trust had already crumpled beneath it, her silence was answer enough. Daniel's face twisted with pain, but he nodded, forcing out a bitter laugh. "I guess that's it then." She closed her eyes briefly, her chest aching. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she whispered. He swallowed hard, rising slowly from his chair. "And I hope you find happiness, Isabella." She nodded, but as she watched him walk toward the door, she knew this goodbye was different from any other. This wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of the person she thought she was going to become. Just as Daniel reached for the handle, a voice broke the silence. "You should be honest from now on." Both Isabella and Daniel turned to see Barron standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his gaze unreadable. Daniel's jaw clenched. "You did this." Barron raised an eyebrow. "No, you did this. I just gave her the truth." Daniel's hands curled into fists. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Barron sighed, stepping inside. "No," he said simply. "I think I did what someone should have done a long time ago." Isabella stepped between them before the tension could grow into something worse. "Daniel, just go." Her voice was firm, final. Daniel hesitated, his eyes locking onto hers one last time. Then, without another word, he walked out of the room, out of her life. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving behind an eerie silence. She let out a shaky breath, pressing her fingers against her temples. Barron watched her carefully before speaking. "Are you okay?" She let out a soft, broken laugh. "I don't know." He nodded as if he understood. Then, after a beat of silence, he said, "You made the right choice." She looked at him, tears burning her eyes. "It doesn't feel like it." Barron exhaled, leaning against the chair. "It won't. Not yet." She studied him for a long moment. "Why did you do it, Barron? Why did you come?" His expression softened, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. "Because I've seen what happens when the truth comes too late," he murmured. "And I didn't want that to happen to you." A lump formed in her throat. He shifted, glancing at the letter still sitting on the table. "What are you going to do now?" She followed his gaze before exhaling. "I don't know," she admitted. "But for the first time in a long time, I think I get to decide for myself." Barron smiled slightly. "That's a good place to start." She nodded, a small, uncertain smile tugging at her lips. As the sun rose over the city, she realized something. She had thought this was the end of everything. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. The hotel room felt suffocating, its walls closing in with memories that had unraveled in a single night. Isabella sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the sealed letter in her hands, the one Daniel had left behind. Her fingers trembled slightly as she ran them over the envelope, as if the paper itself carried the weight of every lie, every broken promise. She had spent the last few hours convincing herself that reading it wouldn't change anything. And yet, a part of her clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was something inside that would make sense of it all. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She hesitated before rising, her pulse quickening despite herself. She had no idea who she was expecting, but when she opened the door and saw Barron standing there, 2 coffee cups in hand, she let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "I figured you could use this," he said, simply, extending a cup toward her. She accepted it, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest moment. The warmth of the coffee was a stark contrast to the cold feeling in her chest. "How did you know I was still here?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. He shrugged, leaning against the dresser as he took a sip from his own cup. "Call it a guess. Figured you weren't ready to leave yet." She sighed, sinking onto the couch. "I don't even know where I'd go." Barron studied her carefully, his gaze sharp yet surprisingly gentle. "You could start by deciding what you really want, not what everyone else expects you to want." She let out a bitter laugh. "That's the problem, Barron. I don't even know who I am without him." He tilted his head, considering her words. Maybe that's the real problem then. Silence filled the space between them. After a long moment, Isabella glanced at the letter beside her. I haven't read it yet, she admitted. Barron didn't say anything at first, his gaze flickering to the envelope before meeting hers again. Do you want to? She exhaled, rubbing her forehead. I don't know. What if it's just another excuse? Another way to keep me in his orbit? Barron set his coffee down on the table and leaned forward, his voice low but steady. Then at least you'll know, and knowing is better than wondering. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the letter. Then, taking a deep breath, she broke the seal and unfolded the page inside. The words were careful, deliberate. Isabella, I don't know where to begin, because I don't know if any of this will make a difference now. I never meant to hurt you. I thought I could fix things before you ever found out, but that was selfish. I let my fear of losing you cloud my judgment, and I see now that I was only delaying the inevitable. I love you, I always will, but you deserve more than a man who kept secrets from you, and if that means letting you go, then that's what I have to do. I hope, someday, you'll remember me as someone who loved you, even if I wasn't worthy of that love. I'm sorry. Her hands trembled as she lowered the letter onto her lap. For a long time, she just sat there, staring at the words. She had expected another excuse, another justification, but this felt like closure. She blinked rapidly, her chest tight with emotions she didn't know how to name. Barron, who had been watching her carefully, finally spoke. What does it say? She let out a shaky breath. It says, he's letting me go. Barron nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time for you to do the same. The word settled over her like a quiet truth she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. But deep down she knew he was right. She wasn't the same woman who had walked down that aisle yesterday, believing in a future that had already been built on lies. She was someone different now, someone who had seen the truth and survived it. She wiped away a stray tear and let out a breath that felt like the first real exhale she'd taken in days. Where do I even begin? She asked, half to herself. Barron's lips quirked into a small smile. Anywhere you want. She looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, she didn't feel lost. The morning light streamed through the hotel window, casting golden streaks across the walls. Isabella sat motionless, the letter still resting in her lap. It felt like an artifact from another life, one she no longer belonged to. The words Daniel had written echoed in her mind, stirring a storm of emotions she wasn't sure how to process. She had spent so much time trying to understand his deception, trying to rationalize his choices, and now, here it was. The truth laid bare. He had been afraid, selfish, but in the end, he had chosen to let her go. Maybe that was the most honest thing he had ever done. She inhaled deeply and reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over Daniel's contact, but before she could dial, another knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Barron standing there once again, his expression unreadable. Are you okay? He asked, his voice steady but softer than usual. Isabella nodded slowly. I don't know, she admitted, but I think I will be. He studied her carefully, as if searching for any lingering doubt in her eyes. Do you want to talk about it? She hesitated. Yes, but not here. Minutes later, they were walking along the riverbank, away from the chaos of the wedding that wasn't. The crisp morning air filled Isabella's lungs, and for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe again. I keep thinking back to that moment, she said after a long silence, her voice barely above a whisper. When I looked into his eyes at the altar, I really thought I knew him. I really believed that he loved me enough to never lie to me. Barron walked beside her, his hands in his pockets. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. I used to tell myself that love meant seeing the best in someone, she continued, her voice thick with emotion. But now I wonder if I was just blind to the truth because I wanted to be. Barron finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Love isn't about ignoring the bad parts. It's about trusting that the person standing beside you will never keep those parts hidden. Isabella turned to him, her gaze searching. Is that what you believe? He exhaled slowly. It's what I've learned. The weight of his words settled between them. She had always known Barron Trump as a name, as a public figure, but not as a man who understood heartbreak, deception, and the struggle to reconcile love with truth. They walked in silence for a while before Isabella stopped, turning toward him. I need to see him, she said, her voice steady now, not to fix things, but to say goodbye properly. Barron nodded. Do you want me to come with you? She hesitated for only a moment before shaking her head. No, I have to do this alone. He didn't argue. Instead, he gave her a small nod of understanding. Then I'll be here when you're done. When Isabella arrived at the cafe where she had arranged to meet Daniel, she found him already waiting. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable, but the exhaustion in his eyes was unmistakable. She sat down across from him, folding her hands on the table. Neither of them spoke at first. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. I wasn't sure you'd come. She met his gaze, her heart no longer aching the way it had before. I almost didn't. A small, bitter smile touched his lips. That would have been fair. Isabella exhaled, her fingers tightening around her cup. I read your letter. Daniel nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. She took a deep breath. I believe you when you say you're sorry. I believe you when you say you were scared. But that doesn't change what happened. His jaw clenched, as if bracing for a final blow. I know. She tilted her head slightly, her voice softer now. You should have told me the truth from the beginning, Daniel. I deserved that. He looked down, guilt etched into every line of his face. I thought if I told you, I'd lose you. She let out a humorless laugh. And, in the end, you lost me anyway. Silence. Daniel inhaled sharply, blinking a few times as if trying to hold himself together. Is there any chance, any at all, that someday you'll forgive me? Isabella studied him for a long moment before answering. I already do, she admitted, but that doesn't mean we can go back. Daniel's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but he nodded. He understood. I hope you find happiness, Isabella said finally. Real happiness. But more than that, I hope you learn from this. Daniel exhaled shakily. I hope so too. With that, she stood. She didn't look back. When Isabella stepped outside, the air felt lighter. The weight of the past few days, the pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it wasn't gone, but it no longer consumed her. She spotted Barron waiting across the street. He wasn't watching his phone or checking the time. He was simply standing there, waiting for her. She walked up to him, feeling a strange sense of peace settle in her chest. It's done, she said. He didn't ask what happened. He just nodded. How do you feel? Isabella thought for a moment before answering. Like I can finally move forward? Barron smiled, his eyes warm with quiet approval. Then let's get out of here, he said. And with that, they walked away from the past and into the unknown, not as people running from heartbreak, but as two individuals stepping into something new. At its heart, this story isn't just about a dramatic wedding interruption. It's about truth, integrity, and the courage to face reality, even when it's painful. Isabella's journey was one of deep love, betrayal, and ultimately, self-respect. She learned the hard way that love without honesty is an illusion, a fragile house built on sand, doomed to collapse. How many people today live in similar illusions, avoiding the truth because it's too difficult to face? Barron Trump in this story wasn't just an outsider meddling in a wedding. He was a voice of reason, someone who had the strength to say what needed to be said. In today's world, too many people choose silence in the face of deception, afraid of the consequences of speaking out. But as this story shows, the truth always finds its way to the surface. The question is, will you be strong enough to confront it? Daniel, too, serves as an important lesson. His mistake wasn't just the lie itself. It was his fear of honesty, his fear of losing something by telling the truth. And yet, in the end, he lost everything anyway. It's a lesson for all of us. When we let fear dictate our actions, we often create the very outcome we were trying to avoid. But perhaps the most important takeaway from this story is the power of moving forward. Isabella didn't let her heartbreak define her. She didn't stay trapped in betrayal. She chose herself. She chose healing. And she chose a future built on trust rather than lies. In modern life, it's easy to get caught up in past pain, to dwell on betrayal, to feel stuck. But as Isabella learned, true strength comes from letting go and stepping forward, even when the road ahead is uncertain. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on your own life, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Let's continue telling stories that inspire, empower, and remind us all that truth and strength will always prevail. What would you have done in Isabella's place? Share your thoughts in the comments below.